Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the Stimson Center and for organizing this event and for inviting me here to moderate the panel discussion, and also for the University of Harvard to host the event. It's truly a great honor and pleasure to be here today, and unfortunately I couldn't attend the discussions earlier today because I had a small accident in New York just when arriving to the airport, but I'm happy to be here now. The aim of this panel is to have an interactive dialogue between the experienced and prominent experts who are now in the public, and also with the students who are here, and with you as future decision makers. And I hope there will be also time after the panel to have more questions and comments from the floor as well, but we hope for that. Before I move to the panel and introduce the panelists, I would just like to say a couple of words as the representative for the Finnish government. The Finnish government has had excellent cooperation with the Stimson Center in promoting the implementation of the resolution, and also this essay competition is an excellent example of Stimson Center's innovative approach to outreach activities. And this year, our government's main focus is on industry engagement, on chemical and nuclear security standards in the global south, and also engaging with the civil society to activate them in a comprehensive review later this year. And as many of the essays highlighted, there's a constant need for awareness raising and training. And this applies to all states, both in the developing world and also in the developed world. And there is definitely a need to improve the interagency cooperation at all the levels, at national, and regional, and international level. And on these areas, the Stimson Center is very active and doing extremely valuable work, and Finland is extremely proud and happy to continue supporting the center. So after this Finnish government's commercial, I'd like to introduce the panelists who are there. Mr. José Javier Gutiérrez Blanco Navarrete is Counselor of the Permanent Mission of Spain to the United Nations. Mr. Greg Finkelstein is Political Advisor at the United States Mission to the United Nations in New York, and Chair of the 1540 Committee's Working Group 4 on Transparency and Media Outreach. Mr. Terence Taylor is the coordinator of the group of experts supporting the UN Security Council 1540 Committee. And Dr. Michael Rosenthal is member of that 1540 group of experts. And here I would like to welcome...
Mr. Ambassador, one person who I didn't know was going to be here for sure is Franz Kolar, who's also here from UNODA.
So I want to invite the winners here as well. I mean, Mr. Adriano Alvarado, the winner Enrique de Vega, Kyle Piluti, Mr. Alvarado, confused, and Miss Rifkin. I think it's better to move directly to the panel, and I'm sure our expert panel has lots of questions and comments to the winners. And first, I would like to invite the panel members to ask questions and comments, and after that, open the floor to others for interaction. So may I start with Mr. Gutierrez? What did you think of our first place winner, Mr. Enrique de Vega-Gonzalez's recommendations for Tunisia?
Should be on.
Yeah. Hello. Yes. Thank you so much, and thank you, Stimson Center and Harvard University for hosting us. Very quickly, I would say that this is almost like a dream come true. Nearly 2 years ago, we talked to Deborah and Brian, the president of the Stimson Center, and all this, and the American mission to the UN. All this seemed like a crazy idea, but we've been positively surprised to see that 150 essays from more than 40 countries, so it's already quite a success. I must say that when I've been going through the essays, one thing that I particularly liked is that they are obviously connected with reality. Sometimes when we talk about 1540 in New York at the committee, it can be a bit abstract. There might be a reason for that behind abstract work and ideas. Sometimes there are political reasons. Perhaps there's not interest about in going into political discussions about 1540 because it's a successful story and it's a preventive tool. I also like that all the essays they've managed to tackle the main challenges that we have nowadays in the 1540 comprehensive review, and I think that these finalists they themselves could write a good draft, at least a draft, perhaps not as good, but close to what the experts have written. I think it's really surprising. Talking about Enrique's paper, what really struck me is that he was linking a non-proliferation efforts, 1540, which at the end of the day is proliferation. 1540 is a figure, but we need to insist it's proliferation. It's main topic. I like that he connected it with development, with domestic politics, with legitimacy of a transition government, with regional stability. That's a consideration that normally we don't see. We see proliferation as or some people see proliferation or non-proliferation as an isolated policy. So that was a very positive factor. I also liked that he was practical in his recommendations, and he addressed some very specific questions, which nowadays are fashionable in the discussions that we have in New York about 1540, like reinforcing OP3, which is controls, export controls, border controls. He put emphasis on the protection of physical infrastructure, of critical infrastructure. That's also important. Not many people mention those concepts, but he really addressed that. And something which is missing from 1540 to some extent, because we are 1540 and the committee's work is mainly preventive, is response to incidents. So I was happy to see that there was some reflection about response, which to some extent is a missing link in some of the analysis that sometimes we see about 1540. If we want to prevent better, we need to know how to respond in case there's an incident. Having said this, and because transparency is very important for the committee, as the coordinator of that working group, Craig can certify. I'd like to know, Enrique, how did you have access to information? How did you document yourself? For me personally, from New York, it's easy to have access because now we are in the Security Council, but when you're not in the Security Council, I think it must be very difficult to know about 1540. So what sources do you use? How do you have access to debates, discussions on non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction by non-state actors? Thank you.
Thank you. So I must admit it was an easy task to do research, because actually the committee, I think, does a pretty good job with transparency, in the sense that in the web page of the committee I could get access to the metrics from Tunisia and from any other country, to the previous action plan, to the discussions they are having with the comprehensive review, the background memo and everything. And in the case with Tunisia, there isn't that many information available specifically about 1540, but I had to translate from general messages which are available, like in the Foreign Ministry webpage. So they have, for example, the objectives of Tunisian foreign policy, and they include weapons of mass destruction. It's just a sentence, but you have to dilute from that sense that there is some political interest, because if not, it wouldn't have been there. So for the technical research, I got most of it from the Security Council and the 1540 committee webpage, which I think has really good resources, and I must congratulate the committee for being open and having all the databases, all the metrics available. Well, it was an easy research for me.
Thank you.
great. Please, what did you think about the, comment to Ms. Piluti's essay?
Hello? Oh, it's on. Okay. First, thank you for having me here. This is an incredible opportunity that my predecessor put in place, working very closely with the Belfer Center, the Stimson Center, and Harvard. And one can never talk about 1540 without giving thanks and praise to the Mission of Spain, who's really been the driving force this past year. I've only recently arrived to the mission in New York, but Javier has already been a great colleague and really passionate. And definitely a lot of this is the result of the tireless effort of your government. I have to say, reading all the essays, I was truly inspired. As I was talking earlier to one of the students, our days are pretty long, and so I was able to set aside a few hours late at night to read all the essays. And after a long day of just writing memos, running from meeting to meeting, it was really to see your passion for this topic was really inspiring. To show the creative mold that you guys are approaching these tough challenges was really fascinating, and I really enjoyed reading all of them. Kyle, thank you again for your paper. You've really set a high bar for me personally because you chose to focus on our government. So I'm sure I'll have to be answering to some of the suggestions and questions you pose to my seniors. And as I indicated to you, this is you've hit all the marks in terms of what we're discussing in New York and in Washington. The question you posed at the beginning of your speech, what are the gaps? As I told you, my seniors and seniors in government are asking of us the same questions. And so one of the main sort of challenges that we all recognize the end goal and the need of 1540, but the problem is some problems are facilitating cooperation and assistance, and you really set a good foundation example of how we can better increase that. So I wanted to get a sense of why focusing on the United States, is it possible to maybe broaden it to other allies as well? And since we're talking about the website and transparency and outreach, just to pose a sort of thought-provoking question for perhaps a future paper on how can we maybe make use of technology and social media to really broadcast the capabilities and successes of this resolution.
Thank you very much for your comments and your question. It's a fantastic question in itself. How do we utilize social media through kind of my graduate studies as well as researching into this topic specifically? There obviously are some governments and some organizations that use social media to a really high degree of proficiency, whether it's for honorable intentions or even nefarious intentions. It makes a huge difference. And so being able to really harness on to that power and reaching out to those who are otherwise misinformed or uninformed on the topic, I think is really, really useful. Specifically when dealing with the United States, our voting population has quite a lot of power, quite a lot of pull, particularly when it comes to passing legislation in Congress and whatnot. And so having the appropriate and correct information simply out to our own citizens as well as then globally, I think is going to be a big next step. We've seen it with trying to pass even treaty. Passing through international treaties seems to be very difficult in the United States right now, particularly with the way that our party system is set up. And I think it is in part due to just misinformation on what these treaties really mean and what they can do, not only for our country, but for the international community itself. So definitely I think that would be the next step in how can we show our country, our citizens, that 1540 is not just a something to benefit the United States, it's also the entire international community. And so working with other countries isn't simply a diplomatic thing that we can put on our web pages. It's something that will benefit us because kind of that term that I'm even regretting now because I've said it too many times, the non-proliferation blanket, is just it benefits us when it's complete. And so addressing those gaps through social media outreach with information in addition to the more relaxed dialogue, which can also benefit us in other international relations endeavors. Simple communication and the levity that comes from that. We see it a lot with students at our graduate school. We have communication programs with, say, students in Russia, and having it on a more academic level spreads, takes some of the contention out of those topics, and so kind of moving forward with that more relaxed, maybe social media, maybe workshops, those particular kinds of outreach endeavors, I think is an important next step.
Thank you.
Thank you. Johanna's essay that we took Turkmenistan, that's a country we don't usually hear so much about. So I think that is extremely interesting information. And may I invite Dr. Rosenthal to comment on Hanna's essay.
Thank you. In UN speak, I associate myself with all the others that have congratulated you. Just to say that and just keep it short. This is a question I could address to everyone in a way, and that is I was impressed by the comprehensiveness of the scope of the action plans that were in the essays, but sometimes implicitly, sometimes a little bit more explicitly, there was little reference to priorities, little reference to what do I do first? What's the near term, the midterm, what's the long term? In the case of the US paper, a priority could be, well, with which countries should I work? Which areas should I work in? Nuclear, chemical, biological? That might be, of course, influenced by the countries with whom you would be working. And in the other countries, say, Turkmenistan, you have to choose. You can't do everything all at once. So there's kind of two questions. One, how do you construct priorities? And the second would be, within a country, who would do it? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. In my essay, and I think something that's been reiterated today, that a way to kind of, there's the impulse to, of course, take on everything, and if you do that and you spread your resources too thin, you get little in return. And so what I tried to frame in my essay as the priority for engagement with Turkmenistan was engaging with them on a front that has been proven effective in the past, and that is border security. Turkmenistan engages in training exercises at the Tajikistan OSCE Border College for border security guards. And so it is my understanding for Turkmenistan's situation that expanding on multilateral organizations that are already working in that area is the most effective way to move forward with implementing Resolution 1540. So I think identifying, when you look at any country, you have to first look and determine that country's needs. And then from there, little by little, working with what that country determines as their needs and saying, well, Turkmenistan needs to work on limiting the drug trafficking and human trafficking. And then pivoting that towards 1540 activities is, in my opinion, the most effective way to prioritize. Thank you.
Do others want to add here? I mean, it was also addressed to the other witnesses.
I can touch on the concept of priorities, particularly with the United States. In my paper, I did slightly cast a really wide net. That is definitely true. I partially at the end I tried to address the really wide scope of my plan, in that it really needs to be a collaborative effort from the start, both with the international organizations and agencies that would be relevant for each of the topics, and so it can kind of mold from there, and so having this kind of joint effort as the atmosphere that it's born out of. But in regards to the specific topics, the weak points that do need to address and have high priority placed on, it's a fantastic question. I don't have anywhere close to a concrete answer on that, but of some of the areas that I had identified in my own research, part of it was nuclear material trafficking in some of the transit states, some of the states where there appeared to be high frequency of cases that they're found in, whether or not it's a radiological material black market, I don't know, but in terms of the areas that seem to have a high frequency of those cases, having priority placed on those areas in the outreach that comes from perhaps National Nuclear Laboratory engagement or simple kind of sit downs and dialogue with the enforcement agencies that are present in different ways that those can be identified. That could be one of the areas addressed, as well as the new technological advances such as additive manufacturing and how that plays into dual use. But obviously with the progression of time and each new event, new priorities and new points are highlighted, and I'm sure I don't even know anywhere close to all of them, but that's where I would start.
Oh, and I'm sorry, I realized I forgot to address your the second part of the question of who was responsible for this. In Turkmenistan, the answer is a clearer one because of the structure of the government. So with that, I would say it is a responsibility of any organization that works within the state to appeal to the head of the state in promoting it as beneficial to the state. And then I think the responsibilities, unfortunately, there is, I think in most countries, a wide diffusion of responsibility. And so then it becomes a little bit more murky. So that's one of the reasons that I found Turkmenistan to be an interesting country to write for, because of that difference in structure of state.
So in my case, at least with Tunisia, the assessment of risk was simple to identify but complicated to address. So for me, in the case of Tunisia, they don't have weapons of mass destruction by itself in the country, so the main risk, of course, is the porosity of the border with Libya. But and I included in the action plan that should be the priority, border control, to avoid mostly chemical weapons to get introduced into the country. But it's complicated because it isn't just a 1540 issue. Border control in general is a much broader issue that needs to be addressed in a much comprehensive way, because we are speaking, as was mentioned in the other panel, of a low probability, high impact, but it's still much more probable that conventional attacks happen. So how do you tackle the issue of border control, having into account both to avoid conventional attacks from happening and conventional small arms and light weapons from being introduced in the country, while also bearing in mind that actually the possibility of weapons of mass destruction is also there and also needs to be prevented.
Thank you. Then there's still one essay left, and that is Russian Federation. And as a Finn, I must say that I'm very curious about it. We share common border 1,350 kilometers, and that's of course sometimes a challenge. So may I invite Mr. Taylor to address the essay on Russia.
Yes, thank you very much. It's the first time I've spoken, and I'd like to thank the Simpson Center for their extremely hard work and setting the whole thing in motion. And thanks to all the 150 or so students who wrote essays. I fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, had to only read 18. Deborah, you read 150, which is amazing. But myself, Craig and Michael and France here, we read the last 18 and so made the final cut. So I was glad to and proud to have the opportunity to do that. And Adrian, yours was amongst the last 18 you read. And I like to make a comparison with the US essay as well, because you both focused on that they have to look outside and they have to give assistance to others. And I think it demonstrates that there's no one size fits all in making just this one part of Resolution 1540, the voluntary, underlined, National Implementation Action Plan. And that voluntary nature is really important. And I would put it that the voluntary element is a very delicate flower. And so from you, Adrian, you're looking ahead and the Russian Federation's position and where they are assisting. Did you see what changes could be made to 1540, if any, or looking through, trying to look through their lens? I know it's a rather political rather than technical question. And I liked your essay particularly because of the way you were looking at it. The Russian Federation does do a lot of collaborative work through the CIS. They recently ran a 1540 National Points of Contact training course in Kaliningrad for the OSCE states. So they are active. And it's a very different atmosphere to when you're in New York in the Security Council to when you're actually in the country. And I remember that too from visits to Ashgabat as well. But if you were to write your next essay, this is a question, you could apply it to all of you actually. I'd like to hear all of them. What would be the next essay if you were running a competition, having your experience of just doing this one part, what would be the next subject? Because in New York, we're inevitably have a rather top-down. You've looked at a single state, and that's a challenge to do that. We as experts looked at all 193 states. We revised their matrices, Russia, United States, and Tunisia, and Turkmenistan. And so that's one question. The other question, perhaps more specifically for you, is what was your entry point? For us, sitting in New York in the group of experts, our entry point is to look at the legal measures that are in place and find the gaps. That's what we do. And if you don't have the legal measures in place, then whatever follows, whatever security culture you might have in place and so on, it doesn't work. So I'm interested to know, was that your starting point? And also my question might be raised to others, because I have in my mind a tabletop exercise where, with a certain country, not to be named, where we had a situation where nuclear material was discovered in a vehicle that was going across a border, and the customs officer had to answer the question, so what would you do now? And his answer was nothing. He said, we don't have a law which actually, so immediately the gap came up. And we don't want to find that out when it really happens. So what was your second, what would be your next essay, or what should be the next essay? And second, what was your entry point into looking at the Russian Federation? Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much for your questions. So I'm going to start for the second one that I consider I will handle better for now. So my entry point indeed was legally at the start, but it was rather to understand where we are standing up. where the Russian Federation action are standing up today, but then having a clear sense that legal action are not sufficient in these matters, because in countries like the Russian Federation, there is always illegal action that can be occur. These problems about incidents that can happen, and then what we do about it. Then incidents about corruption, situation like that, things that in real life happens every day, and we have to live with them. So the thing is that in my essay, what I wanted to propose is something also political, in where you have to take in consideration the national interests of the Russian Federation, and then deal with it. I mean, have the understanding that each country will have certain priorities. So it comes also for the other question. There are some determinants to the willingness of the action they want to take. And then, well, it's related, so first of all, to risk assessment, then also in which areas of the territory they can really act. So, of course, in the case of countries like the US and Russia, there is also I think everybody is committed to make a global action, but still, I think it has to be multi-layer international cooperation, where, of course, the Russian Federation can have some limited action within the CIS, but for example, the core of the action that they can really implement and have a deep international coordination with other countries is with their close allies of the Eurasiatic economic space. So after the risk assessment, the areas of cooperation, there is also the budgetary limits. No, that is an important determinant, and then also the foreign policy and the military traditions about it. So at the end of the day, for coming up with this strategy that I'm proposing for the Russian Federation, I took all these elements before arriving to the legal dimension of our proposal of it. First of all, of course, there is the concrete action that you can take in legislation, again, the action of non-state actors. But on the other way, you have to find out a strategic way to coordinate all new efforts and new ideas within the apparatus and within the SOPs of the Russian Federation and the organization, because you kind of like this. And then about the next contest, maybe someone others can have another ideas on the 2 minutes I'm gonna think about pertinent response about it.
Something that I've been thinking about for a couple months now is, and I don't know if this answers your question about the next contest, but a contest for actually a what-if scenario, some kind of what would happen if a sort of disaster took place. And my hope would be that would be the motivation, that would sufficiently scare people into action within governments. And so I think that could be really interesting to look at.
So my next essay, maybe this is a topic which I raised out of ignorance, but when I think about the 1540 committee, the structure, each group of experts, I feel it doesn't have the necessary, I'm not speaking of course about quantity, not quality, but enough manpower, enough resources to tackle, which is a huge challenge, to deal with 193 states. We have to 193 reports, the matrix, review them, do visits to the states. So what structure, and of course, leaving behind first at least the political sensibilities, but just from a theoretical point of view, what structure do we need to give the committee in order to be more effective in its work? And then briefly about my entry point to the research. I was amazed at first when I realized it was the legal point of view which was first raised, because when I started researching, I read some academic papers in which they speak about the matrix. So in my head, the image of a matrix was of all the critical facilities, the installations, the resources each country had. When I took the Tunisian matrix and I realized it was about legal measures, I was like, wow, so they are looking at the legal issues rather than the physical facilities and capabilities the country has. So I completely acknowledge and I completely agree that without the legal measures you cannot do anything. So you have to start by making laws and regulations. That really struck me, yeah.
I have already my answer. So maybe this option for the next contest is a little bit provocative. It will have some political and security concerns for everybody because it will be red teaming. This time, red teaming. So this time, where we will be on the side of non-state actors, you will pick one, and then you will find out the way to put your weapon of mass destruction somewhere in the world. Then maybe, well, it's a complicated and very controversial stuff, but I'm sure that we can, as you were surprised with some initiatives, maybe we will get the answer for some of the next moves we will find out.
Well, on the topic of red teaming, I feel like that would also be slightly terrifying in which submissions you actually got. But mine actually is in that similar line, but it's more so on identifying the weak points in the current implementation of 1540 and the general WMD non-proliferation regime. And so addressing perhaps what is the most severe weak point, just globally, not from one country itself, but finding that weak point and why you think that is the most important weak point.
Thank you very much, and I'm not sure how much time we do still have.
I don't think we, well, I don't want to stop the dialogue, but maybe if anybody has something urgent, we can go to it. And then, yeah, please.
Well, thank you.
Sir.
Whoops. Thank you very much. Because I think I like the idea of an interaction. I know we're pushed for time, but structure, terrific point, and that's something we worry about all the time. So if you write another essay on that, it would be absolutely great. And I think from three of you, really, I heard red teaming actually.
Yeah.
From all three of you. But let me just put one. I don't think you could do it publicly. But unfortunately, it's a real challenge. But maybe I don't think governments could do it, or the 1540 committee could do it. If you were to take a group like Aun Shinrikyo, which is 1995, well, before 95, but when they did the attacks on the Tokyo subway in 1995, and have a red team in place with the same apocalyptic visions, would they be more successful today than they were, 20 or more years ago? Of course they would, because if their attempts, I know it was a terrible event in Tokyo, and I didn't want to say that it was a minor event. It certainly wasn't. People died, many hundreds were injured, and the political and psychological damage was huge, which shows you only need a small event, like the anthrax attacks in Washington and elsewhere in the United States. I think it was 5 people actually died, but the financial consequences and political consequences and economic consequences were huge. So you have to be careful how we do it. But if you were to take that group now, who made sarin in a garage, and it was, I'm old enough to be call myself a weaponeer, and we weaponeers would call that low-grade sarin, because they had it in plastic bags, they dropped it on the platform of the station, and lots of people were affected, but fortunately not many people actually died. Today, in a room half this size, you could produce weapons-grade sarin, what we would call the real stuff that 20 or more years ago would take a huge facility, like a huge brewery facility, to produce that. So that's just one example. And we think of, in the biological field, of disposable bioreactors, or biological facilities to be cleaned out very quickly. You can make dangerous or enhanced pathogen one day, and then legitimate things the next day. So I just think this red teaming idea is somebody should be doing it somewhere. Perhaps they are, and we don't know about it. But I really hope they are. And this issue of scientific and technical and commercial advances, I think, is one of the biggest challenges for governments in their implementation, as somebody's already said today, is that you don't put a law in place and tick the box, we've done that. It's the implementation aspects of it that really matter. And that is constantly changing, because it's against a constantly changing landscape. And these scientific and technical advances are hugely beneficial and should disseminate, because it brings great commercial benefits, economic benefits, humanitarian benefits. So it's not a control problem. It's not a prevention problem. It's how you live in this risk. And it's all about misuse. I hate that word, dual use. I think it's a huge obstacle. It's misuse, and that's what's focused on. That's why the legal measures are important. It's stopping people misusing these amazing advances, which we all want to come and should come. And how we do it. Sorry, I didn't want to end up giving a lecture, but just as my immediate response to these excellent questions that were raised by the essay writers. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to conclude by thanking all the winners for your contribution, and also for the panel for very interesting questions and comments.
Thank you.
I'm very happy to stay.